Hi, I'm Jim Doti, and welcome to Dialogue. In today's technology-driven world, how and why should we unplug? I'm going to talk about that today with my guest, Pico Iyer. A true global citizen, Pico was born in Britain and spent his school years between England and his parents' adopted home right here in California. Pico now lives in Japan, where he writes about topics as diverse as world affairs, travel, and literature. Pico's writing appears in Time and the New York Review of Books and the New York Times. His most recent book, The Man Within My Head, a book about how Graham Greene haunted the life of its author, Pico Iyer. It's now just out in paperback. Welcome to Dialogue, Pico.
Thank you.
Great to have you back on the show. I think this is the 10th show with us.
Yes.
You have to put them all together.
I'd love that.
But how did you get into this idea of unplugging? In a Sunday New York Times, I get it, and there I read this editorial about unplugging. And I have to tell you, Pico, when I read it, it really resonated with me, because all of us in this techie world, with all your iPhones, with your computers, with the internet, with Facebook, Twitter, it's like all coming at you, and talking about reaching a point where you could stop and smell the roses. Those opportunities are few and far between. Yes. So that's why when I read your idea that we need to begin thinking about unplugging, it couldn't have come at a better time. But how did you think about it?
Well, you're right. I think that article got a lot of response because so many of us are feeling dizzy. We're almost at the breaking point. We don't know how to. The more time-saving devices we have in our lives, the less time we have, it seems. The more ways we have to communicate, the less we have to say. And I noticed that, for example, the latest trend in travel is a black hole resort, where you pay $900 a night in order to hand over your cell phone and laptop when you check in and to get freedom from it. I noticed that my writer friends, who a few years ago were so excited about getting hooked up to the internet, were now paying good money to get these programs like Freedom to be free to disable the internet for up to 8 hours.
And I figure maybe the fact that they're paying exorbitant rates to go to a place like that, even though they're tempted to go back on the net or on the web or on their Facebook, they figure, well, my goodness, I'm paying $1,000 a night for a room to unplug. I better unplug, right?
Yes, and the reason they're going to those places is they sense already that they're addicted, and they don't know how to unhook themselves except by delegating some external authority to take away their implements. Yeah. In China and South Korea, they literally have internet addiction camps now, and they for kids, and they actually have to take these kids into the wilderness.
I can believe it. These kids now, that's all they're on the. Yes. They're all, even you go to a restaurant, they're not talking with their parents or their friends. They're all on either their phone, they're on the internet, or they're playing a computer game of some sort.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, every year these implements get more and more seductive and more voluminous, and so it gets harder and harder to take ourselves away.
The one example that really was somewhat shocking, because it was a tech company, Intel. Yes. Relate, what does Intel do about unplugging?
A few years ago, they tried an experiment where they took 300 of their executives and their engineers, and they enforced quiet time on them for 4 hours every week. Every Tuesday morning, they had to close their door, no telephone calls allowed, no emails allowed, and they just were made to think. And
I think if I tried to do that here at Chapman, there'd be a revolution, but it would be kind of interesting, really. Now, but
yes.
Why is that? So here, that's a tech company,
exactly.
But they saw the value of separating off from all of these linkages
yes.
that connect you to the larger world, so you could think.
Exactly.
Think.
They realized that was only by being unplugged that these executives and engineers could come up with the creative ideas to come up with the next terrific innovation. But as long as we're running to catch up, we can't think, we can't invent, we can't create. And at the end of this experiment, the majority of the people said, well, please, let's extend this across the company for as long as possible. And you know, one of the things that really made an impression on me, I went to visit the Googleplex once, and I saw they have meditation rooms there, and famously Google gives 20% of its time off for exactly the same reason to its employees, because otherwise, if they're always working, they can never make that imaginative leap to come up with the next great Google invention. And what struck me, just as you said, is it's the people closest to technology who are most aware of the limits of technology and the need to be unplugged. So a lot of people in Silicon Valley, I heard from them when this piece came out, said that they practice an internet Sabbath. And the man who invented Wired magazine and who's written wonderfully about technology, he and all his family from Friday night to Monday morning, they have no access to the internet every week. And so they have chance, as you said, to smell the roses, to take walks, to breathe, to think, to do nothing at all. But without that conscious measure, they'd always be running desperately.
Do you find, Pico, that you are also more creative during periods of quiet time, if you will?
Yes, my whole life is almost quiet time. So to this day, I've never used a cell phone. I barely have internet connection in my home in Japan. And exactly that. And
you don't have a car in Japan either.
That's right, and no
so
bicycle.
You walk around, no
Quite,
bicycle,
yes.
so wherever you want to go, you walk or
Yes.
use public transportation, I guess.
Yes, and every day when I wake up, it feels as if the day stretches for 1,000 hours. And you know, I used to live in Midtown Manhattan, 25th floor office of the Time Life building, 4 blocks from Times Square. So I got a good taste there of the joy of acceleration and information and saturation. But I felt that I needed time. It's only when you step out of your life that you can make sense of your life and put things in perspective and decide where you're going next. In a piece of music, it's the pause that really gives the emotion and meaning to a piece of music. And so I felt I needed that pause in my life. And I've noticed so many of my friends, I know you run, for example. They run, or they sit quietly every morning, or they cook. They do something very conscious in order to make sure they have the time to collect themselves and to think. And
yeah, I really believe that some of my better ideas come about when I'm running. Maybe just listening to some background music, or no music at all, just seeing the sights around you. When I was running through the Villa Borghese Gardens in Rome, and I saw these beautiful statues on either side of me, how beautiful, how could I help replicate something like that on the Chapman campus? Exactly. And that became the basis for the bus that we have now at Chapman that commemorate the establishment of endowed chairs. But I don't think I would have thought about anything like that if I didn't have that quiet time, if you will.
Yes, we're always running from the last email to the next appointment. I know somebody like you has a very, very busy life, so we have to ensure that we have that space. So, for example, 20 years ago, a friend of mine who teaches high school here in California said that he always took his classes to a Catholic monastery. And he said even the most distractible, restless, testosterone-driven 15-year-old Californian high school student only had to spend a couple of days in stillness and silence, and suddenly something cleared out in him. He calmed down, he felt much happier, and in fact, according to my friend, many of his students didn't want to come home after 3 days at this place. And so I started going there myself. I'm not Catholic, and I'm not necessarily a religious person, but I just found for my sanity to go every few months for just 2-3 days, and there's no cell phone contact, no telephone there, no internet connection either. Instantly, I knew what to do for the next many months. And so I've been doing that for 20 years.
And you just, do you meditate, or do you
just
walk around the grounds?
Exactly. I just take walks, I write postcards, and I do nothing at all. And that's something I never allow myself to do in my normal life. I always assume I'm wasting time if I'm doing nothing. And there, I found that it's only by doing nothing I can make the most important decisions in my life. And the doing nothing is actually, as you found when running through the Villa Borghese, it's the creative time. It's when you can really come to the understandings you never can when you're out of breath. But I think it's that matter of balance. And I think none of us wants to go backwards or uninvent technology, because we all know these instruments have made our lives so much brighter and happier and longer and healthier. It's just a case of finding that balance and not becoming prey to our machines, so that our tools are not the ones who are ruling us. And I think the one problem with technology, the only thing it doesn't give us, is a sense of how to make the best use of technology. That's to say, the information revolution came without a manual, and all the data in the world doesn't tell you how to process data. All the images in the world don't tell you how to make the best sense of images. So you have to go offline to summon the kind of moral and emotional clarity to make the best use of your online life. And so it's not that I don't just trust technology. I don't trust myself with technology, because I know that when I've got the whole Library of Alexandria in that little white laptop, it's going to be irresistible. And I'm never actually going to look at my family and my wife and my friends, because there's such a strong... So unless I take a conscious measure, I will be slave to these wonderful instruments.
Well, you point out that it's important for you personally to find this away time. This is not something you're doing with a friend or with a wife or members of the family or children. It's time for you to get away.
Yes.
But you mentioned that when you do that, you come back a better husband.
Yes.
Why is that?
I always feel so guilty, for example, when I go to the monastery, because I have all my editors are coming at me. I have 100 deadlines. I feel guilty about my wife not being with me. I'm missing out great parties and concerts and all kinds of attractions. And as soon as I arrive, I wonder why I ever worried about that. And I realize it's, as you said, it's only by spending a little time clearing my head that I have anything useful to bring back to my bosses and my loved ones and my wife.
And what, can you give me
an
an
example? In the
example?
sense that when I'm in my family home and my wife wants to have a conversation, I can't. I've got to take care of these emails and I've got this deadline now, and I'm always running. And that can't be very nice for her. I'm always kind of fractured and distracted and restless and thinking about the next. And she can feel the unread emails ticking away in me, and she will say, oh, you know, please go to your computer. It's hopeless. I can't talk to you like this, because I know that you need to take care of business. And then when I go there, I instantly see really what I care about most, which includes her, of course, and I become so much kinder and fresher and clearer, and then I'm so excited to see her at the end of those 3 days and share with her all the beauty that I have experienced, as she is when she takes her trips away. That
so it's like a detoxing, if you will. So you come back. It's not as if you leave and you come back and get right back into that helter-skelter world. You leave, and that gives you a newfound sense of what's important in life.
Exactly. I feel I have real presence to share with her when she comes back, and she's so happy to see me looking bright and happy and refreshed, and so excited to tell her about.
So she's happy to get rid of you every now and then. So
if the payoff
you'll come
is,
back,
right.
The payoff is when you come back, you'll be more attentive.
Yes, and I know I was talking about this once, and a woman asked me this very good question. Well, you know, I've got 2 little kids, and you know, I'm a mother, I'm a mom, and I'm up at 6 in the morning. How can I possibly have the luxury of ever even having 30 minutes off? And I thought, it's a hard thing to say, but if somehow she just had 30 minutes for herself, she would have so much better energy to share with those kids, because even babies can sense if their mom is out of breath or restless or exhausted. And so even to her kids, I think she probably owes it to them, just 30 minutes being quiet in the room, and she would suddenly bring that brightness and clarity to her kids. And it's hard to force ourselves to take those measures, but I think ultimately the rewards are really good. There's a famous quote of Gandhi's, and he woke up one day and he said, today's going to be a really busy day. I don't have a chance to meditate for 1 hour. I've got to meditate for 2 hours. It's wonderful. It just reminds you that by meditating for 2 hours, then he can really do justice to his busy day.
Be more productive for the rest of the time.
Be more productive, yes.
Yeah. You mentioned in the article on unplugging, you talk about this monastery where you stay and you go back, and you talk about a person you met there that that knew you 20 years earlier, and he's with his son, I believe, the young son.
Yes.
Relate that.
Yes, so I was walking along this monastery road above the ocean in Big Sur, beautifully still environment, and suddenly I see a man with, in fact, his wife and 2 little kids. And he suddenly calls to me, Pico. and very surprised. And it did turn out that we had met just once, 20 years before. And I asked him, oh, what are you doing now? And he said, well, actually, I work for MTV in LA. There couldn't have been a more perfect answer. And we're surrounded by the great still blue plate of the Pacific and 800 acres of completely unpopulated dry brush, the most serene, pristine environment.
Yeah.
And we don't need to say anything. And he says, well, I really want to share. He had lived in the cloister working there many years before, and he realized from that he wanted to share it with his kids. And he said, you know, this is the third time for my little son, age 7, and I want to make sure he has this in his life. And I thought that was so wise, that his 7-year-old is, I'm sure, already got an iPad and a cell phone and all the great modern things. But to put it into perspective, just having that great stillness and the beauty of the ocean and that absolute silence, I thought, well, that 7-year-old little boy is probably wiser than I am at my age, just because his dad has been sensible enough to expose him to this as well as to all the excitements of the modern world. So he has the old and the new, and he has stillness as well as excitement and movement. And
yeah. Now, in your book, in your own thinking, when you need this quiet time and when you unplug, reading, does that help or hurt?
It helps. I think if I were really rigorous and disciplined, I wouldn't even take books, or I wouldn't even take a pen and paper. And I really admire those people who just sit in silence.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the interesting things about this monastery I go to, it took me a while to notice, is most of the people there are lawyers, teachers, CEOs, real estate agents, people in the most high-pressure jobs who just have the sense to realize that to do justice to those jobs, they need to unplug. So it's not just writers like myself or would-be monks or and to the credit, these wonderful Catholic brothers open their doors to men, to women, to Buddhists, to atheists, to Sufis. And so it's an interesting variety of people there, but often the people in the most pressured jobs are the ones who are unplugging.
Yeah. Now you still don't have a cell phone.
No.
Pico, you're a presidential fellow now, so you're at Chapman University interacting in classes with our students. But you mentioned that when you got here, you had to make a call.
Yes.
So really,
it's wonderful for me to be at Chapman. But yes, when I was driving down just yesterday, and somebody had told me, please give a call to the conference's facilities manager when you arrive so she can give you a parking permit and show you to your room. And I was getting closer to Chapman, and I was realizing public phones barely exist, and I was thinking, how am I...
This is like the old days when all of us with technology would think, how do we deal with this in the old day before we had a cell phone?
Yes.
Well, you don't have one, so okay, you're thinking now, what do I do?
That. And it was easy 20 years ago for us to deal with it because a lot of public phones, but now harder. Yeah. And just as I'm turning the final corner, I'm 30 seconds away from the arrival, there's a kind of beaten up little liquor store on the corner, and I see a blue sign that says telephone, and I see a call box right outside the liquor store. So I thought, you know, I had faith in the fates to protect me, and it works out. I've got to tell you, though, a couple of years ago, I was taking my mother on a cruise, and we landed in Estonia. It's a beautiful town of Tallinn, and I wanted to call my wife in Japan to share it with her. And I walked around, I didn't see any public phone, and finally I went into a hotel, which is the most reliable place. And I said, do you have a public telephone? And the woman looked at me as if I was crazy, and she said, none in the whole country. We've eliminated public phones in Estonia, which is in fact the place where Skype was invented. And you know, we're well out of the 14th century now, she more or less told me. And I realized soon in this country and every other country, public phones are not going to exist. And at that point, I'm going to have to break down. But as long as I can, I will survive, as you said, the way I survived happily 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the house where my mother lives in California is exactly the same as the monastery. It sits 1,200 feet above the Pacific. It looks over the ocean. Anybody seeing it would say this is the last word in tranquility and secludedness. But the trouble is, when I'm at home, even if I'm at my desk, I can hear that little chime of "you got mail" in the next room. Even if the phone isn't ringing, I'm always braced for the phone to ring. And so I'm never really, it's a landline,
and
but
you're
I'm
always
still
on deadline.
Exactly, and so I'm always distracting myself, even when the phone isn't distracting me. And at nighttime, there are so many stars above, but I never think, oh, I can just sit and look at these stars because there's so much to do around the house, or I can go to the supermarket, or there are more emails to pick up. Whereas the monastery, just knowing you can't do any of that, suddenly you feel so expanded, and you feel back in that wonderful state when you're a mountain climber, so you know when you climb a high peak and you're just looking out over that great space and thinking about your life and enjoying that liberation. That's the sensation I get whenever I'm in this.
Yeah, I never thought of that, Pico, but now that you mention it, perhaps that is the allure, because people say, why are you doing that? You're in the freezing cold weather, it's uncomfortable, there's no bed, no water, but now that I think of it, that is about the only time I really get away from all the connections with the outside world.
Yes.
And it's refreshing, and I usually climb with my son.
Yes.
So we have time together. It's kind of like maybe that father with the young boy off on Big Sur,
yes,
where
exactly.
you're disconnecting, and you can really, you really come together at a time like that because you don't have all of these other interruptions.
Exactly. And then I think when you come back, you have so much to share with your wife. I mean, from that journey,
you come back
accumulating
a different
riches
person,
inside.
really, in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
More
I
in
think
tune with the world.
Exact equivalent. And so that's why I tell my friends, it doesn't have to be a monastery you go to, but some people like to take walks in the Sierras for a week, or climb mountains as you do, but something or other, just to ensure, as you said, that you're in tune with the elements and something bigger than you. And then you go back ready to take on your duties much more vigorously than you would otherwise.
Your book on Graham Greene, how he haunted your life, is now in paperback. The Man Within My Head. What would he say about unplugging, or what would you learn from Graham Greene about that?
Well, he was a great traveler, and I think part of the lure of travel is being away from weapons of mass distraction, as it were, and all the complications of the modern world.
That. Weapons of mass distraction, not destruction, distraction.
Yes, yes.
Very appropriate.
And I also was thinking, one small thing a writer can do now, maybe, is to liberate the reader from this bombardment that you get on your TV screen or computer screen. So one thing I did in this book was I made the sentences very, very long, almost as if to stretch the reader's attention span. And I deliberately didn't give a resolution at the end of the book.
Not James Joycean to that
Not quite that bad, but on the way to that, many reader probably was frustrated with the length of my sentences. But I thought that a typical reader today is getting lots of information from her laptop and lots of exciting things coming in.
Little,
exactly.
Yeah.
But a typical book can maybe take her to a more spacious place inside her heart or imagination or memory, where suddenly she's getting the kind of inner equivalent of being on a mountaintop or being in a monastery. And maybe that's something that writing can do that all the new exciting multimedia instruments can't do so well. So I was consciously...
So your style was such to draw the reader to this mindset of having to be absorbed in the book.
Yes.
It's not Twitter where you have to have the message in 30 words and but longer sentences. Interesting.
Yes, because I noticed in my own case, I felt something in me had been crying out for this stillness and spaciousness, but I was running around so much I couldn't hear that. And so I was like a guy who puts on a blindfold and says, oh, I can't see the light. It's a self-imposed problem. And so I thought, well, the reader might be grateful to be ushered into this larger imaginative space.
How did Graham go? Well, you've studied his life and Somerset Maugham, and how did the writers like that? How did they unplug? Because obviously it wasn't the techie world it is today, but there were a lot of distractions.
There were.
So how did Graham Greene unplug?
Again, he loved very small spaces. So for the last 30 years of his life, he lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the south of France, away from London, away from... he almost never appeared on TV, I have to say, as we talk on this TV show. And I think he lived a very simple life because simpleness brought happiness. And my description of happiness is absorption. In other words, I'm happiest of all if I'm having a really good conversation with you, if I'm reading a book, if I'm deep in a movie, and I forget what time it is and I forget where I am. And I think that when I lose myself, that's when I'm really happiest. And so anything I can do to bring back that sense of absorption. So I think in Graham Greene's case, or Somerset Maugham's, they traveled so that they were really encountering the world one-on-one without distractions and without mediating things. And in Greene's case, they both lived in foreign countries in the south of France, and in Greene's case, lived very simply with his books and his closest friends and his thoughts as a way to kind of steady himself and make sure that there was ground in his life beneath all the excitement of the moment. And writers do that, and I think I'm inspired by Thoreau, for example, who did that as well as anybody.
So that might be another Walden Pond. Walden might be a good book to read and to think about.
Yes, it never gets old.
Any other books that might get you in that kind of frame of mind?
Walden is the best one because it's amazing how in 1850 Thoreau anticipated and addressed everything we're dealing with now. He says, the horse that trots a mile a minute doesn't bring the most important news. In other words, getting something very quickly doesn't mean it's the most urgent thing we should be attending to. And I remember in those days, the big new thing that was happening was that a telegraph was being laid between, I think, Boston and Maine, so you could get the news very quickly. And he said, what use is that if all we're going to hear about is that a princess has a whooping cough? And I think of that now that we're fascinated with Princess Diana or William and Kate in England. We're getting every last detail of their lives, and they're sort of interesting up to a point, but are they the most important things we need to be hearing about? Not, probably not, but because our TV screens and our computer screens give us to them, we're suddenly caught up in these things that if we stop to think, we realize we're not being sustained or enlightened or inspired by. And there are other things that are inspiring us probably that we're turning away from. So,
I love the comment where you mentioned that when you're away from the country, you're in Japan, and you come back after 6 months and you open the paper and you kind of get caught up with what's been going on, you realize nothing's really changed.
Nothing's happened.
Nothing's happened.
I've been away for 3 months in Japan. When I fly back, I get to San Francisco Airport, and I have an hour before the connecting plane to Santa Barbara. So I go into the bookstore, and I read all the magazines on the shelves. And I've found probably every hour of those 3 months, there's been breaking news across CNN, and this has happened, this has happened, this has happened in the presidential campaign or whatever. And at the end of 3 months, there may be 2 or 3 new developments I need to read about, and I can get them in an hour in the newsstand at the airport before returning.
Everything that's enveloping everybody else's life over those 3 months, keeping tabs on everything, keeping your Facebook going with the latest news and so on, and Twitter, all of that, you're realizing most of it is irrelevant.
I feel that, yes, and it's keeping us in a constant state of agitation and fracturedness. And, you know, now President Obama is 1% up in the polls. Now he's 1% down. And
after 3 months, who cares?
He's back where he was. Honestly, it really happens like that. Or the NASDAQ index, or whatever it might happen to be.
Now, we only have a couple of minutes. How are you enjoying your week stay at Chapman as a presidential fellow?
Oh, I'm thrilled. And I'm learning so much from the students. Yesterday, I sat in on a creative nonfiction class, and I sat in on a class on literature and translation. It was humbling to me because in the second class, we were talking about Japan mostly, and I've lived there 25 years, and many of the students were telling me things about Japan that I'd never thought of, or crystallizing perceptions I'd begun to move towards, but they put it so succinctly. And in fact, in the first class, the teacher asked me this great question: you've been writing for 30 years, do you know more, and are you wiser now than when you began? And I pointed out, and I've realized in recent years, I often knew more when I was 23 than when I was 53. And sometimes I'll work for 4 or 5 years in Japan, I'll finally come up with a great revelation, and then a little later somebody will tell me something really interesting. I say, where did you get that from? And he'll say, oh, it was from an article you wrote in 1987. And I'm humbled to realize I knew more when I was a kid sometimes. And so I was telling the students, please make the most of these years, because actually you're sitting on a kind of wisdom and an openness and a freshness that you may never get again. And you may well know more now than 30 years from now. So please enjoy it and make the most of it, and write or paint or make movies or do things now, because you'll never retrieve those open eyes quite in the same way.
And you're going to be giving a public lecture here
soon.
And what will be your topic?
This year I'm going to talk about the new global culture that students at Chapman and students at universities around the world are creating. And I think maybe next year when I come back, I'll talk about unplugging, because this is so much on people's minds.
Pico, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for being our presidential fellow this week at Chapman University. You're certainly bringing a lot of excitement to the campus, and I learned a lot. I'm gonna try to work on some of these techniques and ways to unplug, and being a person, I think, more in tune with the world. I'm going to try to stop and smell the roses.
Well, thank you. It's an
honor and a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show, Pico. Great to have you back.
Always a delight. Thank you. There's been a couple of, there's a book called
Funding for this program was provided by Chapman University.